Today's guest is a strategist, policy analyst, and one of Washington's most respected voices on leadership and national security. She founded the Eisenhower Group over 3 decades ago and has advised governments and institutions around the world. She's also written one of the most compelling leadership books I've read in years, How Ike Led, which examines the principles behind the biggest decisions of her grandfather, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe during World War II and America's 34th president.
We stand today
a date which will live in infamy.
I have a dream.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Susan Eisenhower, welcome.
Thank you, Howard. Great to be here.
It's an honor to have you on. So I'll start here with a simple question. How did Ike lead?
Well, he led with strength and humility.
And was he born to lead? I think someone at West Point in your book actually said that about him. Or did he learn to lead? Which
I think it's a combination, don't you? I mean, I think there's this kind of a secret sauce in the Eisenhower family. I say that because his brothers also went on to be very successful.
Unbelievable.
But he was extremely likable. That helped a lot. And he didn't take advantage of his likability. He connected extraordinarily well with people, too. So if you're going to lead, people have to follow.
Absolutely.
And I think that he had some of that magic that really paid some dividends during World War II.
Yeah. So you were young, and by the way, congratulations. You're the first guest I've ever had on that has had Secret Service protection. So,
Gosh.
you know. But
There's some stories there all by themselves.
I
right?
bet we could do several podcasts on that. But could you see it as his granddaughter? Could you see, and you were young, obviously, but could you see in him the leadership ability and presence? He was president. Was he a different person as a grandfather than as a president, or did you see it in your granddaughter-grandfather interactions?
I think his West Point yearbook summed it all up. His roommate described him as big as life and twice as natural. And the thing that was extraordinary about him, though, is that, I mean, you look at his record, and he had to make some of the toughest decisions anybody had to make during the 20th century, but he had this extraordinary kindness about him, and he was always making everybody around him feel terrific. Having said that, he had a temper, and he had to learn how to control it. So it makes him a rather interesting character in that regard.
I picked that up. I think you said in the book he was emotional, but he didn't make emotional decisions.
Yeah, think about that. I mean, that really requires a lot of self-discipline, which I think he got from his father. His father was tough. He was a disciplinarian. It was his mother who encouraged cooperation, humility, fairness, all of those things that he also displayed in his leadership and in his career.
Your father also attended West Point, right? What was it like for your father to follow in his father's footsteps?
Well, I'll give you an anecdote on that. I called him up one day and I said, I'm calling to congratulate you. And he said, for what? And I said, for graduating from West Point on this day. And he said, oh, I thought you were calling about the Normandy landings. My father, coincidentally, graduated from West Point on D-Day.
Oh, wow.
And of course, when he came out onto the stage, the place went crazy because everyone had been waiting so long for that event. But he didn't even get his graduation by himself. And I think at some stage decided to become a writer, and he had a very, very distinguished career as a military historian and strategist. And
he served in the Korean War,
he did.
Right? And
he was also deployed during World War II as well.
Okay, interesting. So you say in the book that that Ike, your grandfather, was not a leader in the way we customarily teach leadership in our country. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think there are a couple of things about leadership training. We tend to say the what, not the how. Mm-hmm. And I was hoping that my book conveyed some of the how, including finding time to let your brain rest, not to bypass relaxation and some fun, because your brain's still working, and it needs a fresh take and fresh inputs. But I think also the other thing is in leadership training, we don't really differentiate between strategic leadership and operational leadership. And I feel very strongly about this. The person who's running everything has a million moving parts to turn into some kind of coherent approach. Whereas operational leaders, they have a huge amount of responsibility that you can't do one without the other. But this responsibility is more finite. It's more focused on one particular part of the operation. So it's rather ironic that the assessment of Eisenhower in history books tends to come from his subordinates who only had one specific lane within the operation, because they're really not comparable types of leadership. They can be in some respects, but not in the bigger picture. So I just encourage people to analyze how his bosses looked at his performance, because that's who he reported to.
I think one of the things that struck me is not just his leadership down, but his leadership up and across. People like Churchill and de Gaulle, his superiors when he was in Europe during World War II, they didn't have to. I mean, he was working with them or for them, but I felt like he led them as well.
Well, that's very observant of you. Actually, I don't know if you remember in the book that story about Operation Anvil. And Churchill absolutely did not want to see a simultaneous invasion at the same time as D-Day in southern France. And so they got into a rather heated discussion, and Churchill said he was going to quit. Churchill said he was going to quit. So the next day, Eisenhower writes, actually, I think a fairly brilliant letter about the reason they're all in this war together, and then went on to explain his reasoning, and then said if it's, of course, a political question, it should be referred to the President of the United States. Otherwise, we're going to go forward. And then he ends it by saying, I think you have no idea how much I admire you and how much your support means to me.
Yeah.
And then Churchill writes him back, okay, I won't quit.
Brilliant. I mean, it's just as important, if not more important, up the food chain. And obviously, he wasn't just commanding the U.S. Army, he was commanding the Allied Army. And that comes with responsibility beyond reporting to his superiors back in Washington. And he obviously did it incredibly well, and we're all grateful, I think, to this day for what he did.
Well, back to managing an array of unconnected things that require, he had his own personal goal, which was what I would call unity of purpose. And this was really a hard job during the war, because we have to look at it from the British point of view for a second. They could feel their empire shaking, and they could see that this war would be of such consequence that they might actually jeopardize their entire empire.
And they were getting bombed.
They were getting bombed, exactly, and all of these things. And so, to be able to manage this emotional moment, and then think of it from the British point of view. This younger guy comes in, and suddenly he's in charge, and they'd been in the war longer than we had. And there were a lot of egos to check and to support, in a way. So, Howard, my conclusion on all that is I think his real talent during the war was that he knew when to deploy his own ego and when to suppress it. And that's one of those principles that would stand us all in good stead. What do you think?
I think so. And no, that point jumped out at me. I mean, on some level, there's no way as a leader, certainly as a leader in that situation, you have to have somewhat of an ego. You have to believe in your ability to do amazing things and big things and world-changing things, but you can't necessarily show it. And that's one of the feelings that I took away from the book was tremendous humility. In my own, somebody recently went to one of our longtime folks and said, how do you work effectively with Howard? And our senior person said, whatever you do, don't kiss his ass, because he hates it.
That's
which was, like, to me, the highest form of a compliment.
I would say so.
And he felt to me like he was in it with his troops. He was in it with all the people that worked for him. It wasn't about him. There was a tremendous sense of humility. Is that accurate? That's how I felt.
Well, I think it is, and he got that from his mother, who advised him at age 7 or 8 that if he didn't get control over his temper, he was sort of finished before he started. And she she paraphrased the Bible, that he who conquereth his soul is greater than he who taketh a nation, or whatever the exact wording is. And I like to say if he hadn't controlled his soul and his behavior and his emotions. But let's go back to the fact that he was a very emotional man. So how did he do it? I mean, he was a human man. So I learned a lot of things from him. Thanks to him, I kept a written journal for about 20 years. And it makes rather shocking reading, given what things I've been thinking about, so long ago. But he did keep journals, and he wrote in them. Obviously, certain times in the war he didn't, but that was one way to blow off steam. Instead of doing it outwardly, he was managing the things that he needed to put aside, and he put them aside on paper.
And he put him aside on canvas, right? He
put
became
him aside.
A painter.
He became a painter. He was a very good cook. He loved hunting and fishing and all those things, which were not. It's not vacation time when you're in those periods of responsibility at that level. This is about letting your brain recharge, let it do its own thinking. It's gaining some perspective on the situation.
Amazing. One thing that jumped out at me is that when he was at West Point, he wasn't, these are my words, a cookie cutter cadet. He was
Good expression.
Yeah. He was somewhat, I don't know if rebellious is the right word.
I think that works, yeah.
But he wasn't afraid to challenge conventional wisdom.
Or he was, but he did it anyway.
Okay. But he did it without losing trust.
Yeah.
The juxtaposition of that rebelliousness with his superior saying he was born to lead in his reviews at West Point, how did he manage that? How do you push back? How do you rebel without losing the trust of the people that you're working for?
Well, I have to say that probably not everybody on campus agreed with that assessment, because actually West Point of the 1915, which was the class he graduated from, it was a very rigid place. Today, if you want to have a fantastic conversation on almost any subject, go to West Point or the Naval Academy, because they are taught to be open-minded. They were not taught to be open-minded in those days.
Okay.
Now, there were a couple of factors here. First of all, Ike was older than his own class because he'd stayed behind to put his brother Edgar through college. So, being 2 years older can make a big difference at that age. He came out of, a prairie town. Suddenly he's in New York State. It's a completely different world, and he's doing things like asking questions. Now, you weren't supposed to ask questions there. You were supposed to be absorbing what they taught you, and that was doctrine, and there you are. But I do think it's significant, and I noted it in the book, and I got a big smile out of it, is that the three great commanders all had rather dodgy disciplinary records. I think Ulysses S. Grant was absolutely down at the bottom. Ike was somewhere in the middle to the lower middle, and John Pershing of World War our commander of American forces during World War I, had this same kind of position in the, and I think that came from, asking questions. Why are we doing it this way? Why don't we think about doing it another way? And that was not appreciated.
Yeah. I had the good fortune when I served in government and was the chief operating officer of the TARP at the Treasury Department, working for Hank Paulson. There was a White House fellow who was assigned to Treasury, and he was at that point a lieutenant colonel, went on to run the leadership department at West Point and retired as a brigadier general. But I had this amazing guy who was my second in command, and when we identified, in trying to explain or describe the kind of people we were trying to find to come into the program and rescue the financial system, he said we needed risk takers with character, which...
That sounds like the three I just mentioned.
Yeah.
Right.
So to me, that's always stuck with me. And it jumped out at me in the book and felt like that's what you were kind of saying about your grandfather.
Well, there's another part of the story that I think is very interesting, and that is that many people look down on him because he'd not been actually in combat during World War I. He was actually training the 1st Tank Corps of the United States. It was a separate service of the military, and he was the first commander of this tank corps at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, as a matter of fact. And I think that ironically, maybe there was something useful about the fact that he hadn't been in the First World War, because the tendency to fight the last war is very strong. It was the same generation who fought in the First War that fought in the Second War, at the leadership level.
Yep.
And as we see during World War II, many of them, including Montgomery and others, are operating more like a war of attrition as opposed to a war of mobility. And Eisenhower, having studied World War I, very carefully, because he was assigned to do an analysis of the American battlefields of France, understood, along with one of his mentors, that we can't fight the next war that way at all. So maybe it's important to have experience in life, but sometimes you can have the wrong experience.
Yeah.
Or the out-of-date experience.
Just to press on that a little bit, did it cost him anything with the people under him? Was his leadership questioned at all?
Yeah, well, it was, and I think he earned his way out of that skepticism. But I think the British were particularly upset about it. I wouldn't say upset, but they used it as a critique they would pull out often when they weren't getting their way strategically. Okay. I think the other miracle of this war, and you can argue till the end of the day about so-and-so disagreed about this or that or the other thing, actually it was kind of a miracle because the British had a completely different strategic approach. They had a completely different command structure and culture. Mm-hmm. Actually, they had to have a whole panel sit around and figure out which words they were going to use, whether they're going to be American words or British words. A big discussion about whether we're talking about the hood of a car or the boot or all of these different words. And they had to have a committee to decide, what the vocabulary was going to be. And so when sometimes one side or the other didn't get their way, they'd say, well, Eisenhower's never had any combat experience. Well, that's not entirely true, but because he certainly had plenty by the time the war was over, being at the front,
Sure.
But anyway, I just think that's always an interesting side note that you can have experience, but it better be the relevant experience going into a new period.
Yep. Interesting. The family anecdotes in the book are so interesting on a lot of levels.
Hysterical in places.
Most definitely. A lot of them relate to correspondence between Ike and his brother Edgar, who he put through school, as you said earlier, back and forth while he was president. They were really interesting. But one that really jumped out at me was, or a family matter that really jumped out at me was his brother Milton, who was the president of 3 different universities in his adult life and had an amazing career and obviously was an amazing individual, but I guess wasn't as physically gifted as his brothers. And I thought this was like just an incredibly poignant reference in the book. He said to you that your grandfather gave him the confidence to be who he was, to be himself.
Yeah.
Which was it just because I think that is the essence of a leader. You have to let people be who they are.
And if you've put them in if they're in the wrong position, you've got to understand they're always going to be who they are. No, actually, I remember when Milton told me that. I had just gotten to know him when I came to Washington. And as a matter of fact, I moved to Bethesda first so that I could be close to Baltimore, so I could be close to Milton. And he told me so many things about his older brother. Now, remember, these are 7 boys, my poor great-grandmother. 7 boys.
I have 2 brothers, so I can't imagine 6.
6 survived, but Milton was the youngest. And he was probably, by some of these brothers, given a hard time because he wasn't a footballer, he wasn't a baseballer, and he was interested in books. Actually, Ike was interested in the books, too. But he gave Milton permission, and he was very emotional when he told me that. He said it changed his entire life. Instead of feeling like a failure, the older brother he admired said, "You go for it."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that came through.
Yeah, that's nice.
Why did you choose to tell the story a lot through that correspondence? Was it because it reflected Ike's thinking, or it was available, or...
Well, I think part of it is I used family letters because everybody knows what it's like to be in a family. And sometimes, in the political world, you'll see people, not being exactly who they are, trying to keep their image a certain way or this and that. But when you finally get down to family relations, it gets real fast.
Yep.
Ike had an older brother who was, well, let me put it this way. They were the perfect political spectrum, that family. So Edgar was the very, very conservative, very opinionated guy. I don't put those two words together, but he was conservative, and it happens he was also opinionated. Milton was the liberal, and Ike was the middle child. So part of the reason Eisenhower believed so much in cooperation and bringing people from all sides of an argument into things is that's how he spent his childhood. Listening to these two people debating at a table, well, why don't we try a middle way or a different way or something like that?
Amazing.
Yeah.
From the dinner table to the White House.
Well, Edgar also was giving the president advice, which did not sit very well with his younger brother. And I was at the White House once when Edgar came to visit, and they were obviously in the middle of some kind of thing, because I remember my father saying the next day, why couldn't Edgar keep his mouth shut? He went out and gave a press conference, and I paid attention to that. And it turns out that he was criticizing his brother's presidential policy. So at the next press conference, and I think this is fairly hysterical because Eisenhower held a press conference every week, and one of the reporters asked him, "What's it feel like? Are you insulted or something that your brother has said these things publicly?" He says, "Oh, don't worry about that. He's been criticizing me since I was 5 years old."
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Brothers,
what can you say?
So I want to go back to D-Day for a second, because the general had written a note premised on, well, what if we don't prevail? Mm-hmm. And put it in his pocket. And how did he think that they might not succeed? Was he unsure, or did he believe that, no, we're going to win, but just in case I'm going to slip this? Like, what was that? What did that reflect?
Well, I think it reflected a couple of things. That he, no matter what happened, he wasn't going to be blaming anybody else. And that's a very important principle that he would have carried with him. Also, if you get yourself into a crisis, it's better to have thought through how you're going to handle it before it happens, because people don't think clearly in crisis moments. Did he think that it wouldn't be successful? Well, I don't think that they would have staged the operation. But having said that, it was the largest military, integrated military assault in the history of warfare at that time, and it may remain that way simply because of the scale.
Yeah.
Now, people say the largest amphibious landing, but truthfully, it was way more than that because of the use of the Air Force and the Navy. I mean, it's just on a scale that people can't process.
And multinational.
And actually, it was also the first time that there was a supreme commander who actually had control over land, sea, and air. Because normally these, especially the Air Force, had a much more independent role from the chief commander. So this was really a groundbreaking exercise in more than just scale, but also in organization.
Yeah.
And so, it was in many ways a test of his own leadership. And he even wrote to people beforehand, he understood that if it failed, that it was the end of his career, and so be it.
How would he say one balances confidence and realism? Because that's kind of what that was. I mean...
Well, I think he put it in very simple terms, that he was going to do the best he could. And see, I think all of us human beings sort of know when we didn't really give it the best because we were too distracted or we didn't focus or we didn't allow ourselves to think about something. But if you really put everything, your heart, your mind, your soul, your training, your respect for everybody who's following you, then all you can say is that you did your best, and nobody can do better than their very best. I think you have to be a little, I know there's a movement called Stoicism today. I think he was a Stoic. I really do. I think he understood that, after he gave the go, it was out of his hands. But he was still going to take responsibility for what happened afterwards. Mm-hmm. And you have to have a rather Stoic mentality for some of that.
Yeah, accept the outcome and
accept
be
the
kind
outcome.
of fatalistic about it. In his presidency too.
Yeah.
There were lots of anecdotes, whether it was dealing with McCarthy or other things, dealing with some of the foreign policy crises that erupted as he was running for a second term and dealing with health problems at the same time. That came across. He put his best foot forward.
Yeah.
And the chips, wherever they fell, but still very, very challenging to...
Yeah. Well, you have to have made some kind of pact with yourself, I think. And then I think it's also worth saying that he came from a deeply religious household, and somehow the teachings of his parents, they were part of a subset of the Pennsylvania Brethren Mennonite community. Pacifists, by the way, which is also kind of interesting.
Very interesting.
But I think, they were always preaching putting something larger than yourself. And ironically, even though they were pacifists, when he got to West Point, it all merged for him. Mm-hmm. So he took his oath to defend the Constitution of the United States when he was in his teens. And so unlike other political leaders, that was the focus of his entire life and career.
But between serving the Army and running for and winning the presidency, he was, and I've forgotten this, the president of Columbia University, which is kind of shocking on some level because...
I think that's what the faculty thought.
Yeah, it's inconceivable today that a general would ever serve as the president of an Ivy League university. How things have changed.
I must say that Columbia chapter was very, very important for the presidency because he became quite close to especially the physics department and others. And he was learning all about a lot of the new technology that was coming along because he wasn't in the military anymore, and had some real insights into this. As a matter of fact, Isidore Rabi, one of the most famous physicists in the United States, was on the first science advisory committee that Eisenhower put together in the White House. So he benefited a lot from understanding these developments, and that's a good thing too, especially in another period of big technological change.
It seemed like he thought that, I think it was in the book, that the best way to combat the threat of communism, the totalitarianism of Adolf Hitler, was to educate people.
Yeah.
So to me, it made sense that was one of his chapters because that was his kind of worldview, that democracy must be shored up through education. What would he think about where higher ed is today and that idea of shoring up democracy through education? Because, gosh, our higher ed system, which obviously is under a lot of fire, I think from multiple perspectives, there's a lot of bias. There's a lot of reform that is probably needed. And what would he think about where we are today?
Well, of course, in education, there's a fun fact that in his high school yearbook from Abilene High School, it was predicted that he was going to be a history teacher at Yale and that his older brother was going to be president of the United States, which I think is pretty hysterical because Edgar ended up being a lawyer, and I don't know what Edgar thought when he read everybody's high school yearbook predictions, but okay, so that's that. But he loved books himself, and I think politically he used to be, I don't know, ridiculed in a way for reading Westerns before he went to bed at night. This is like reading kind of a trashy novel, or a book of humor or some kind of, mystery thing. This is a way to get to sleep. You don't want to be overstimulating yourself. But if you look at his bookcases out in Gettysburg, they retired to that area. I mean, you've got every war strategist on the bookshelf, and it was so bad as a kid he collected these books. His mother locked him up in a closet because he wasn't doing his chores. So, he had a very intellectual side. And so he would care a lot about the perspective that the writings of others bring to your worldview. Mm-hmm. I think he would be in full support of a liberal arts education. But the thing is that I think part of the problem in higher ed is we're not figuring out how to actually apply that to the challenges we're having today. And I think he'd probably encourage that, is my guess.
Explain that a little bit.
Well, I mean, at least the way it's advertised, a liberal arts education looks like a mighty nice thing to happen, but or to have, but maybe not clearly necessary
Not
for getting the
practical.
jobs of the future. And I think that's not correct. I think we're going to find out that AI is, going to be making some decision options available to people, but you have to be able to continue to think. And the other thing is that AI is not going to be experiencing human experience. And, I'd like to maybe use this opportunity to say that one of the most impactful things I've ever seen in his writing revolves around human nature. And he wrote his mother-in-law a letter. I actually have that letter in my possession at home. And he said that he'd always thought that human beings are more emotional and sentimental than they are intellectual or logical. And if that stands true, human beings will not be written out of this AI picture because they can't feel things.
Right.
And as he would probably be telling us if he were here today, the most impactful things that drive everything from warfare to everyday relations are love, hate, vengeance, joy, fun, all of these things. But they all happen inside human beings.
Yep.
So I don't know.
A man ahead of his time.
Well, let's just hope he's ahead of his time and that the AI doesn't try develop other qualities that we can't envision yet. But I'm pretty confident about the future in that regard.
So, what was your grandmother like?
Oh, she was terrific. She was she had such a marvelous sense of humor, and I wrote a book many years ago called Mrs. Ike. I don't know why I've run out of now family stories, but they're usually based on correspondence because they were all letter writers and journal keepers. Uh-huh. But I did that because, A, she didn't get enough credit, or women don't get enough credit for what they do for these men. But truthfully, it's the book's called Mrs. Ike, I think, Memories and Reflections of Mamie Eisenhower. The truth is it's a real story about his emotional life because, boy, could he write love letters. And who knew, right? And but she was a kick. She had a great sense of humor, but it was a kind of self-deprecating humor, or a joke on herself. Like she told me once, "I'm told I have beautiful eyes, and I know how to use them," Or she'd say, "Actually, everybody thinks I love pink. Yes, I love pink, but I like blue better. But I get compliments on pink." Because she was really joking about how she had to present herself to the public. And she gave us all a lot of support, a lot of ways to think about how to quasi-live in public life and how to have a private life at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been tremendous pressure for her to, obviously proud of all of your grandfather's accomplishments, and she was part of all your grandfather's accomplishments. I'm quite sure of that, but with that comes tremendous pressure.
Well, it's another internal discipline requirement here, because actually it's always harder to be home waiting instead of being where the action is. And so for 3 years, he did make a secret trip back to the United States just before going into the D-Day period.
Yep.
Called back to talk to General Marshall and others and to see her. And they thought that was important because nobody knew what was going to happen. But the waiting thing requires a lot of discipline. And not just that, but, as was true of so many people during that war, there's a kind of disconnect that forms from you become more independent.
Yeah.
Everybody becomes more independent, and then they have to get back into the rhythm. And she was brilliant at that. She was, and she did it through laughter.
Did he know that she was able to do all that?
He did. He wrote her this wonderful letter. The General Marshal tells me how you conduct yourself, and then he says something like, "You're a thoroughbred, Now, I have to tell you, Howard, I wrote Mrs. Ike because you're right, I've spent most of my career in the foreign policy area, in the strategy area. And, I knew where all the papers were, and I thought, wow, I really need a break from other people's revolutions and all these things. And things were sort of in a little quiet period. And somehow I managed to write this book, and there's nothing more relaxing than reading other people's mail, especially if you know the people. And but I came out of that, understanding a lot more about how hard it is for our veterans and their families, and how strong she really was.
Yeah, amazing.
And I think this is a story that isn't often told. But I wrote the book also because I found a letter. It was his letter to her in case he died during the war. I found it while I was helping my mother clean out a box, and it is a very emotional letter.
Sure.
And I mean, it's typical Ike, but well, if somebody sends me a love letter like that, I'll be thrilled.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to see that letter published. He signs it, he talks to her at the end after he tells her what she's meant to him. He tells her that, that she can do things for other people and to continue to do that because that's where her happiness is going to be. And then he signs it, your lover for all these years. Wow. Okay, So I called up my father because he's mentioned this letter. I said, I think you want to have this letter. And he said, no, I don't want the letter. I have enough of this. And he said, you keep it. I said, okay, I will.
For sure.
Yeah.
What was he most proud of? Was he, in terms of his various roles in public life, was it the presidency? Was it Supreme Allied Commander Europe? What do you think he would say he was most proud of?
I think he said it, actually. And I'll tell you how that is. After he left office, President Kennedy contacted him and said, is there anything I can do for you? And he said, yes, one thing. I'd like to have my military commission back. So he took down the name of President Eisenhower and became General Eisenhower again, and he was buried in his uniform in a GI coffin.
That about says it.
Yeah, that says it, doesn't it?
It sure does.
So what he was really doing in his mind during the presidency was simply an extension of serving his country.
Yeah, it felt like he was a bit of a reluctant president in a way. I mean, obviously you have to want to be president. He ran for president. But that's the way it felt to me, that he felt he was doing it because he had to do it. He had to serve his country.
Yeah. This is very hard for the civilian community to understand. So a lot of scholars say, he was a clever dude, and this is how he really managed to, he was extraordinarily ambitious, and this is how he wormed his way into the presidency. I would refute that because we never heard anything like that at home. He wanted to rest deeply after the war. I mean, if you can imagine the level of stress. And my grandparents had lost their first child, a boy at the age of 3. So when he saw these young men, his own son would have been in that age group. And, every loss of life there, hit him in a special way, in a distinctive way, I should say. And so, I think that, he wanted to rest deeply. So the idea of becoming president, I think if there had been a Republican, he was concerned about the fact that the Republicans had been out of power for 20 years. Mm-hmm. They were blamed for the Great Depression. And I think if he had felt that there was a Republican who could win and win in the new era to carve out a new future, he would not have run. Mm-hmm. But Robert Taft refused to support NATO, refused to allow the United States to join the United Nations, and was very, very conservative in a looking home kind of way. Mm-hmm. I think if they had that conversation, and
isolationist, right?
Yes, isolationist, and I think that was when Eisenhower said to himself that he was going to. And then the Democrats were engaging in massive deficit spending. We had a war underway, and the rest of it, and it was a combination of all those things that made him change his mind.
So, I asked you what he was most proud of. What would you say? What would he say was his biggest mistake?
Oh, I think he'd have a list, and because he was very accountable as a human being, like that letter you mentioned earlier, very accountable. Be hard to say which would have been the biggest mistake, because that would have also included his emotional life, and maybe there was some way they could have averted their first son's death, which haunted both of them in a way.
Of course.
Yeah. I mean, every birthday, every time this young boy's birthday came around, Granddad would send Mamie a dozen yellow long-stem roses because it was the little boy's favorite color, and roses were a favorite flower all the way up until the end,
Wow.
So I think there's a kind of stewardship that comes with your children that is so completely basic. But
On
in
its
the
own level.
in the decision-making area, I'm sure there were things about the war that, there were things about everything.
How about Nixon?
I don't know about that. He did keep his mind open to offering the opportunity to be vice president, I believe, in a second term. How much of that was really serious and how much it wasn't? You see, the secret to a person like this, if you are going to show restraint and humility and all these things I described, while you're also an emotional person, it takes tremendous internal fortitude, and sometimes people rely on that too much.
Yeah.
So as my brother and I were watching the documentary film Crusade in Europe, which was a documentary made from his World War II memoir, he wasn't going anywhere near the room where we were watching that. He didn't talk about the war. If you asked him a question, he'd give you an answer. But he was not reliving any of that, like most of the veterans who came back from that war.
Yeah. So he famously saw it the middle way. Mm-hmm. He was courted to run for president by both Republicans and Democrats, which on some level is inconceivable today. But if he were dropped into 2026, what would he say? Are we just fundamentally different today or not? He was challenged by new technology then. The television was new technology.
Sure it was. We were, it was the dawn of the space age and the dawn of the hydrogen bomb age, yeah.
I can't imagine him being a guy who would say, we have no hope.
No.
But we've got this tremendous polarization in society, in the country, frankly, globally. It's not, the United States is not isolated or special in that regard. It's everywhere. But what would he have said about hopefulness and the future of the country?
Oh, listen. You nailed it. He was always optimistic about this country. There are many quotes in the book, I think, about his faith in the American people, and I have that enormous faith in the American people too. I think there's too much money in these divisions. There really are. And if I could see if I can paraphrase one of his quotes, it'll also be an insight into his thinking here. He said something like, the deep divisions in our country are a benefit to an alert enemy. Uh-huh. In other words, he saw it as a national security issue, the unity of the country. And that's when I said during the war his job was unity of purpose. And I would say it was the same obligation he felt during his presidency. I mean, it's also inconceivable practically that 80% of his legislative agenda passed Congress that was held both houses by the opposite party. You know, a lot of that was he didn't differentiate between Democrats and Republicans. And Mamie said, you know, when she gave, they had regular dinner parties and things, don't tell me what political party anybody's from. She didn't want to know. He didn't want to know if he didn't know the people on the list himself. And I think that helps a lot.
Yep.
I think there are a bunch of things we could do right now to make things less divisive. But, you know, we've got algorithms that are telling us to come this way down the rabbit hole with me, and you'll hear a bunch of people say, you know, reinforce your position. And if I could just add one thing here, sorry to be talking too long on this particular question,
please.
but, you know, I think this question of unity is a national security issue for us as well. And I think there is a real opportunity for all of us to find ways to rebuild our communities and the rest of it.
Yeah.
But he represented a kind of nonpartisan leadership.
I thought the point about understanding that nothing could get done in one president's presidency. By definition, things had to be bipartisan in order to kind of stand the test of time.
Well, that's right. And that's what I would call sort of political sustainability.
Yeah.
Or I should say policy sustainability. And that is a very, very big point. It's remarkable. And he did this by entertaining them, too. Every Friday evening, you know, he would invite members of Congress up on Friday evening to sort of run through the week, and this kind of personal touch really made a difference. The other thing is, and you know this from reading the book, he did not believe ever in calling out people by name for certain things, and believed that all you would be doing, he was criticized quite heavily during the McCarthy period because he would not use the so-called bully pulpit to attack McCarthy himself. And Ike's position on that was, well, why would I attack him personally? Because it would shore up his support.
It would give him oxygen.
It would give him oxygen, and he wants to be in the limelight because I think he wants to run for president. And it's not that he was going to be jeopardizing Ike's tenure, because this was 1954, and he was not going to be running against Dwight Eisenhower. They were of the same party.
Yeah.
But what he did is that he said, but I will, you know, get up and talk about what America is and what American values are. At one stage, when Roy Cohn and, you know, his sidekick David Schein were running around Europe taking certain books out of libraries, you know, because they were un-American or something like that, there were all kinds of episodes of book burning and that type of thing. And so instead of mentioning any names, Ike gets up and says, don't join the book burners. And then he goes on to say, reiterate American values of access to information. Yeah. Well, I should also say one thing. He really believed in inputs from all opinions. And so I hope, I'm sure you picked up on this, but there were real similarities between how he ran the war and how he ran the White House, in the sense that his cabinet looked like the raucous group at SHAEF headquarters during the war. He actually selected people who were like Montgomery, who were like Bradley, who were like, people of opposing positions on certain issues, because it helped clarify his thinking.
Yeah, I mean, sign of a good leader, you surround yourself with smart people who aren't afraid to speak their mind.
Exactly.
I'll tell you, I was at an event the other night at a reception, and I bumped into somebody who had worked in White House leg affairs, and somehow, I can't remember what he said that made me mention the book, but I mentioned the book, and he said, Howard, President Eisenhower created the Office of Leg Affairs in the White House.
He did, yeah.
And the org chart is exactly today what it was back when he was president.
Oh, my goodness, that gives me the chills. I actually knew the first person who took that position. And, you know, when I first came to Washington, so many of these people who'd worked for him were still in Washington. So I made my way around and said, just, you know, do you mind if I come talk to you about that experience? And
yeah, amazing. Yeah. Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you. I mean,
Well, I want to thank you for reading the book, and I'm glad that you found something from it. Let me just end by saying, if you don't mind, Howard, thank you very much for this opportunity. And secondly, I just wanted to say that by the time I finished the book, and I relied on a lot of outside analysis of his wartime experience in his presidency, but I realized that Ike still has something to say to us.
Yep.
There are a lot of similarities between today's environment and challenges and what they faced in the 50s. Obviously, everything wasn't nearly as, complicated because of technology, but it was pretty complicated.
It was complicated, and that came through. It's much, the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's not, there was polarization back then. We had our internal challenges.
We did.
We've had them before. We'll have them again. But truly, obviously one of the great leaders in the history of our country, and to be able to get the firsthand experience through you is an amazing opportunity for me and for people that watch and listen to this. So thank you again for being on. I'm honored, and this itself is service to the country. You're writing and documenting all of this and giving it to us to absorb and learn from. So thank you for being on, and thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Take care now.
Thank you so much for joining us for this edition of In Conversation. If you enjoyed it, the best way to support the podcast is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. New episodes are released on Monday at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. For more information on Cozen O'Connor Public Strategies, please visit our website at copublicstrategies.com and follow us on social media.